In this training, you have used both flex containers and controls. In this video, you will learn about the parent-child relationship between these components and how to define the position and size of child components explicitly and with percentage values. Every visual element in a flex application is part of a hierarchy called the display list. At the top of the MXML application hierarchy, you will find the application container. In other words, it is the ultimate parent of the application. A parent component is always a container of some sort that can hold other containers or controls. A child component, therefore, can be either a container or a control. When laying out and sizing a component in the application, you must be aware of properties set on the parent, the component itself, and its siblings. All of these factors can affect how a component is displayed. If you are struggling with laying out a particular component, it's helpful to remember that a child is constrained to its immediate parent. In other words, a button control inside of a panel container can never be positioned outside of the panel container. Always look to the control's relationship to its immediate parent container first when trying to debug a layout issue. This is the starter application for this video and the associated exercise. There is a header area with a logo, title text, and date display. The three areas for Employee of the Month, Cafeteria Special, and Company Picnic are custom components that extend a container. Over the course of this video and the next, I will gradually improve this display to fix some of the more obvious problems like the display of this congratulations message, and also add some touches like keeping the date text field aligned to the right side of the application. In the main application code, you can see that the layout property is set to basic layout, which means that all of the immediate child elements will be laid out absolutely using X and Y property values. I am control clicking on the Employee of the Month custom component so that you can see that it extends the group container, which by default also applies the basic layout instance. This means that its children are also laid out absolutely with X and Y properties. The cafeteria custom component, however, is laid out using the panel container and a vertical layout instance. This means that the immediate children are stacked vertically relative to one another. The monthly events custom component also lays out its children using the default basic layout display. Note that it only contains one child, this text area control, which does not define X and Y properties, assuming that it will automatically be positioned in the upper left corner or 00 point of the container. It does add some padding properties so that the control does not butt up right against the side of the panel. When you lay out components in containers, you can do so in three ways. Absolute positioning uses the basic layout class and requires that you explicitly declare X and Y property values for all the children if you do not want them all piled up on each other in the upper left corner of the container. Relative positioning uses the vertical layout, horizontal layout, or the tile layout classes, and all the children are laid out relative to one another, vertically stacked, horizontally placed, or tiled in rows and columns. Constraint-based layout also positions the children with the basic layout class, but does not define X and Y properties. Instead, the children define their position relative to their parent container using anchor locations and pixel values. You will learn about constraint-based layout in the next video. When sizing components, you can do so in four ways. The first is default sizing. Some but not all components have an explicit or relative default size. For instance, a Spark combo box control is by default 146 pixels wide by 23 pixels tall, while a Spark button control sizes itself to fit the text displayed in its label property. You can also define absolute sizes to your components by setting width and height properties to explicit pixel dimensions. The components will stay that size regardless of the size of the parent container. You can also define percentage sizing by setting percentage values in the width and height properties of a child component. This is a relative value to the parent container. The child's component size will change if the parent's size changes and will be the specified percentage of the parent's size. Lastly, you can define constraint-based sizing. As I mentioned before, constraint-based layouts define a child's display relative to pixel offsets from anchor locations within the parent container. Like percentage sizing, constraint-based sizing can change a child's size based on the parent's size change. Back in the browser, you can see that the congratulations message is running off the end of the application. I'm returning to the Employee of the Month MXML custom component file to see that the rich editable text control doesn't define a width property. I'm setting the control's width property to 100%. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the control still extends outside the application. This is because the parent container, the group container defined here, does not have a width property value either. Back in the main application, I am setting the width property of the Employee of the Month component to 220 pixels. Now when I save the file and run the application, the text value is constrained to the 220 pixels defined for its parent container. Note, however, that the header, employee name, and employee image are all left aligned. I'm returning to the Employee of the Month custom component and changing the group container into a vgroup container. This will force the controls to vertically align relative to one another and ignore their X and Y properties. I'm adding a horizontal align property with a value of center to the container. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the parent container has controlled the layout of the children by horizontally aligning them to the center. The rich editable text control looks like it's disobeying its parent, but it is also horizontally centered as a whole. If you want each line to be horizontally centered, you would need to change the justification on the text control itself. If I scale the browser to the right, you can see that the three columns of content don't take advantage of this additional space. They are all statically positioned in the application. I'm going to apply percentage values to the three containers to have them scale appropriately to the available space. Each of the components defines an X and Y property. I need to change them to relative positioning in order to use percentages. I am nesting the three components in an H group container. And then removing their X and Y properties. When I save the file and run the application, the H group container overlaps the header because it does not have X and Y properties defined. Remember that the H group's immediate parent is the application, which is set to a basic layout implementation. Also note that the containers are more closely placed next to one another. Back in the code, I'm assigning an X property with a value of 20 pixels to the H group container. I'm also assigning a Y property with a value of 90 pixels. Again, this is to account for the basic layout of the main application. I'm also adding a gap property of 20 pixels, which will ensure that each of the age group container's children stay 20 pixels away from each other. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the containers are now well positioned, but they still do not scale to fill the available space. Back in the main application, I'm setting each custom component's width property to 33%. When I save the file and run the application, you don't see much of a change. This is because the age group container itself does not fill the entire application area. It's only making itself large enough to fit its children. I'm adding a width property to the age group container and setting the value to 100%. Now the age group container will grow to fit the available width of the application. When I save the file and run it again, the three custom components scale up or down, with each one taking up 33% of the available space. Remember that a child component is constrained to its immediate parent. So even though each of these children want to be 33% of the available browser window, they cannot exceed their age group parent's available width. You must first expand the parent to expand the children. We can further improve the application display with a few more tweaks. Note that the Company Picnic text field does not fill up the entire component area as it expands. This is an instance where the child is not taking advantage of the parent's size. I'm returning to the monthly events custom component and adding a width property to the text area control with a value of 100%. Now when I save the file and run the application, the text field always fills the panel display. Lastly, when I resize the browser to a very small size, you can see that the image control in the Cafeteria Special exceeds the panel container's dimensions. When I resize the browser to a very large display, the Employee of the Month display looks awkward because it does not have enough content to take advantage of the additional space. You can mix and match absolute and relative values between siblings in a container. Once the fixed size components are accounted for, the application will divide the remaining space among the percentage-based components. Also, if you define more than 100% of the available space, all the percentage-based components will scale evenly to maintain the ratio between them. Back in the main application, I'm adding a min width property to the Employee of the Month custom component with a value of 200 pixels and a max width property with the value of 250 pixels. Now I'm adding a min width property to the Cafeteria custom component with the value of 250 pixels and a max width property with the value of 300 pixels. Note that all three components still have percentage widths set to 33%. When I save the file and run the application, you can see that the first two components still scale up or down a little as the browser resizes, but they stop scaling when their displays would start to look awkward. The third component, however, continues to scale to take the remaining area even though its percentage may exceed the 33% value that I set. For your next step, watch the video titled Using Constraints to Control Component Layout.